Okay, so briefly, who am I? What led me to this problem of the new SaaS cyber kill chain? I started out very much in the red teaming space at a company called MWR. Did a lot of offensive research in that space. Then I moved into the detection response space, and then I was designing EDR, designing threat hunting approaches, that kind of thing. And I was looking at how do I catch someone like myself from what I did previously. But then I went to push, and we stop identity attacks. That's what we're focused on. So I've been purely looking at identity attacks and SaaS security research, and I basically had to throw away almost everything I already knew from my previous career, because I was approaching the question of how do you compromise an organization without touching the endpoint? And that's kind of where this research piece started from. So I'm going to take on a bit of a journey of where I went from sort of zero to hero on this over a fairly long period of time. So as an agenda, we'll look at a brief history of how we got here, a little bit on SaaS adoption. Then we'll consider what traditional attacks are. I'm thinking around endpoint sort of attacks here. We'll look at that briefly. Then we'll look at what does the new cyber kill chain look like in this space. We'll go through a few different key phases and some attacks in there. That'll include slightly new flavors of old techniques, but also some brand new techniques too. We'll be doing a lot of sort of deep diving in some of that. So one of the newer aspects is at the end, I'm going to sort of chain it all back together and look at a sort of connected identity attack, show what it all looks like when you piece the pieces together. So I like to look at things in terms of eras. I got into the industry in the mid-2000s. I view that now very much as the network perimeter era. It was when there were port scanners and vulnerability scanners, and we were finding, exploits in services that were external facing, and we were trying to bypass the network perimeter. Then we had DMZs and network segmentation, firewalls, patch management, all that good stuff that tightened that network perimeter and made it much harder. Then enter the 2010s, and I remember shifting as a red teamer towards the endpoint perimeter era, where we started compromise endpoints instead. We've suddenly thought, hang on, there's all this huge attack surface on endpoints. They sit right on the internal network. Why don't we just send some phishing emails with some Office macros or some file format bugs or whatever, get a memory resident implant running on an endpoint, and then laterally move around the network. I spent a lot of time doing that as a red teamer, and then I spent a lot of time looking at that by designing EDR and doing threat hunting research. And obviously the industry as a whole, that's where things went. The biggest thing that came out of this was the EDR industry, but obviously there's lots of other things around that. Threat hunting and SIMs became important, and now we're fairly mature in this space now. It's not that these attacks can't happen, but the sort of endpoint perimeter is a mature area. But if you look onto the 2020s, I see it now as being the identity perimeter era. And the question mark is in 5 years' time, maybe 10 years' time, if we look back, what are we going to say? Well, what are we going to say are the things that were introduced as a result of these changes? So a key point is what drives shifts in attacks. I alluded to this before, but I think there's two areas here. One is cybersecurity specific, and that is improved security controls. If we introduce great security controls that block existing attacks, attackers have to move and find something else. We had that long in the past with things like firewalls and VPNs and patch management. More recently we had sort of EDR and XDR making the endpoint perimeters attack, and that pushes people to other areas. But there's a higher level one, that's technological shifts. That happens way above us in the security industry. That's in the technology industry in general. We saw that in the old days with complex web applications introducing new attack surface, with Wi-Fi being a whole new perimeter. More recently, the sort of commonality of remote working and SaaS-native organizations has introduced a whole bunch of new attack surface, and the sort of rapidly diminishing internal network in smaller organizations. That's a higher level technological shift, which means we have to drive attacks in a different direction because of it. So if we look at SaaS specifically, even this kind of graph is a little out of date, but you can see that we've had an explosion in SaaS use across different organizations. Pretty much talking about any business app. You don't host yourself here as a SaaS app, but its use has risen rapidly. It was rising anyway. Then we had, increased remote work and the pandemic and all these other things that just accelerated it further. And now it's very, very common. So the other aspect of this is product-led growth. So a lot of SaaS apps are based on product-led growth. So they encourage self-adoption and bypassing procurement and centralized IT teams. So there's lots of things, and smaller organizations are often SaaS first, like Push as a company. We don't have any internal infrastructure. We're a fully remote company. We're all SaaS apps. We don't even run VMs. Our product is AWS hosted and all serverless. But enterprises we see are moving rapidly. So this is just something that's happening across the sort of entire sector. So from an infrastructure comparison point of view, forgive my extremely simplified network diagram, but on the left is what I would say things used to look like 10, 15 years ago. We'd have an internal network, we'd have a DMZ, we'd have most things hosted on the internal network, laptops and servers. We'd have maybe a webmail server and an app server or something on the DMZ. And then we'd have roaming users connecting via a VPN, and then you'd compromise laptops and desktops on that internal network and have them speak outbound to some command and control server. Now, though, this is what it looks like. We tend to have laptops directly on the internet connecting to a range of different SaaS applications. They may do that directly, or they may also connect via an identity provider. And then identity attacks are often just targeting directly the apps themselves, or maybe going via the identities via the user's browser or something like that. So it's a very different sort of infrastructure comparison. A company like Push, where we're entirely the right side of this diagram, and what we tend to see with our enterprise customers is they are both simultaneously, and we've got this left to right shift where the left side is gradually sort of parts of it are drifting away and more is building on the right side. So what does the kill chain look like now? I sort of started from the sort of MITRE attack framework as a basis, and well, I guess Lockheed Martin, I think, were the first to sort of talk about the kill chain phases. I thought, have the phases changed at all? Or are they the same? Is it just the attacks within them? And I think broadly speaking, most of the phases make sense. Where I think it's changed in this space is particularly command and control is very sort of network driven about bypassing different kind of network segmentation controls and moving around. That doesn't exist in the same way in the SaaS world because everything's kind of intended to be internet accessible. Command and control doesn't really apply in the same way. The main other difference I would say is execution. We'll come to that later, but execution traditionally you'd say is gaining like native code execution or script-based code execution on a host or something. SaaS apps outside of serverless functions are kind of designed to not allow you to run your own code, but there are some interesting things that fit into this space we'll look at later. But broadly speaking, the others apply, I think, and it's just what attacks go within them. So I'm going to move on to some phases now. I can't speak about everything today, but I want to go through some of the most important phases, whiz through a few of the key attacks. Some of those, as I said before, are going to be like pretty old familiar attacks, but with slightly new flavors. And some of them are going to be brand new and give you an idea of what this looks like. So we'll start briefly with recon. Traditionally, this was port scanning, service enumeration, that kind of thing. In the SaaS-native world, that's not what we're talking about. We want to know what SaaS apps is an organization using, how are they connecting to them, what are the cloud identities that enable access to those. Is that via an SSO portal? Is it a direct cloud identity on the app itself? Is it a combination of both? That's what recon looks like for a SaaS-native organization. We're trying to understand their SaaS attack surface rather than their open port attack surface. So there are very simple techniques for doing some of these things that are very similar to old techniques in web apps, for example, things like SAML enumeration instead of, say, username enumeration. SAML being a protocol for enabling SSO. Lots of people like to do that to SSOify the SaaS apps they use. I'm just using RAMP as a random example of a SaaS app here. You can see me trying with a domain that doesn't exist and another one that I found as a user on their website. You can see that a particular domain has been set up to enable SSO flow, and in doing so, it returns the Okta instance that they were using for that too. So in that, we can see, okay, that company is a user of RAMP, and they connect to it using their Okta instance, and here's their Okta SSO instance. That's like an example of enumeration in this kind of space. Another one is something called slug tenant enumeration. Often you have to create a tenant with SaaS apps, and you often name that a little bit like a domain name. Sometimes it's called a slug. Can be in the path, it can be a subdomain, various different things, but you pick it. And this is a common thing. So I'm just using Bamboo as an example here. Similar case, but you can often see a differentiation between an invalid tenant and a valid tenant. Now, because anyone can pick this name, this is no guarantee that in this case, say SoundCloud that was on their website is actually a user. A bit like a domain name, you don't know for sure that it's the real people that have registered it, but it's a good indication. In this case, you can then see that they've allowed local email and password logins, but they've also connected it for SSO via their Google account. So then you know, okay, they're probably a Google house with a Google Workspace instance and using that for SSO as well. These are really basic techniques, but these are kind of things you can do to start performing some enumeration. Okay, so moving on. Initial access is obviously one of the most key phases. It's where you get started with anything new. So in this space, traditionally, I'd be thinking about phishing attacks, office macros, that kind of thing, and generally achieving an endpoint compromise. In the SaaS-native world, obviously, we're not looking at endpoint compromises. We're focused on cloud identity compromises. So some of the things in this space are really old techniques like credential stuffing, but they work differently. Or we got slightly new variations of phishing. So instead of achieving endpoint compromises with phishing, we're talking about doing new things like consent phishing or using new delivery vectors like instant messengers instead of email. We're talking about using attacker in the middle techniques to bypass MFA. And we just want to compromise cloud identities. So credential stuffing, very simple, around since the beginning of time, but it used to be, in that old network diagram I showed you, there was a webmail endpoint and a VPN endpoint to test creds you gained access to against. And if they were secured well and there was MFA and stuff, you might not get very far with creds you gained access to. Now there's like thousands of SaaS apps that you can try things against that someone might have signed up to outside of SSO. So it's just massively increased the attack surface for this. It's a really basic attack technique, but it's just the attack surface is increased in this space. If we go on to other forms of phishing, we've got things like consent phishing. This decouples phishing from authentication. So we're talking about using OAuth to grant access to privileges in someone's account. So this bypasses MFA because it's disconnected from authentication, and it uses URLs that are legitimate URLs like Microsoft URLs, Google URLs, and you try and convince someone to click that button and say, hey, give me access to your mail, and then they've got permanent access. So consent phishing is another aspect that came in here since OAuth was pretty much created to enable sharing of data between SaaS apps, and this is an offensive use of that technology. We've also seen a lot of changes with phishing in delivery vectors. It used to be email was almost 99% of phishing. Obviously, that's we've had things like smishing, SMS and that sort of thing, but also now we have instant messenger applications and other vectors. So like Slack and Teams, when they first came about, were internal only. Then they were so useful that people wanted to use them externally. So you've got Slack Connect now and Teams External Access. That means now you can sort of spoof and make connections to other organizations and use that as another delivery vector. So this is just an example of using a few basic spoofing techniques in Slack, just renaming your company, using other people's names and photos. And most users are not as familiar with this as a vector. They've been trained to worry about emails. You can even do basic link preview spoofing techniques here. So like that bottom link I've got pointing to our blog, actually that's pointing to a phishing server I've got set up, and that's just spoofing the preview when it sees a Slack bot in the user agent, which does that preview, but actually if a user clicks on it, they get taken to my phishing server. So there's all sorts of things you can do there. And then obviously like secure mail gateways and things that have normally analyzed links coming in from outside the organization, they're not looking at this. So it's just like another vector. And you can build up a rapport with users by talking to them before delivering your phish rather than the sort of slow means of email. This has really changed things quite a lot. And I know red teamers that have been operating in this space with Teams and Slack have said it's like it works so much better than when they use email techniques now. And the other aspect of phishing is attacker in the middle phishing and browser in the middle phishing. These are some examples of some open source toolkits for this, but they're based around proxying so that you can bypass MFA. So you're not just collecting credentials, you're actually proxying the connection to the real target, and then you steal the session instead. I'm not going to talk about this more now because I'm going to show this in a demo later. But this is something that's become much more prevalent now for compromising like core SSO accounts and anything protected by MFA. Okay. Moving on to a brand new style of technique. This is an interesting one I come up with called poison tenants. And the idea is rather than attack your target's tenants, you can set up your own tenants and use them maliciously. So you can sign up for a new tenant in a SaaS app, and then social engineers to users at your target org to use it, and then you may gain some access that way. So most apps, they want you to invite users to expand their user base, so they'll let you invite users by email, and then they'll send a legitimate email out from their addresses on your behalf saying, hey, you've been invited to join the team, do you want to join? Now, of course, I'd love to say I could just invite an organization to my own Slack tenant where I've got access to all the data and migrate over a whole bank or something. That's obviously not really realistic because that's a big app that someone's going to be using already. But when you start looking at smaller apps that different teams are looking to use, like maybe a new marketing solution that from recon the marketing teams are looking to use anyway, and then you set one up and you pay for it and you start inviting people and talking to things, it starts becoming a little bit more realistic that you get someone on your tenant. That may give you some access anyway, or it may be that it's just something very simple you use to launch further attacks, which we're going to come to shortly. So maybe the SaaS platform itself is nothing to be concerned about from a security perspective, so people aren't thinking about it. Maybe it's like a GIF generator, but you use it as a launching pad for other attacks later. So I'm going to combine that poison tenants with SAML jacking, another attack in a sec, in a video. The SAML jacking is another interesting technique in this space where you use SAML for offensive purposes. So it's a good security technology for SSO, but there are malicious ways to use it. So it works by, during the login process, redirecting someone to the IDP that they're supposed to log into. If we control the settings on that app, we can redirect them anywhere we like during the login process. So for example, I could set up a malicious tenant, configure it for SAML, and then redirect it to a phishing server of mine, and then send someone to a legitimate SaaS domain for a tenant I control. And they look at that domain and go, okay, that's legitimately whatever that app is. And then during the login process, they get redirected to my phishing server when they've already thought that the link was okay. It's not when you're expecting to get phished. So you get something like this. You go to say, I've used Nuclino, which is a wiki in this example, and then you get to Nuclino and then you click the button, you get taken to a phishing server instead. So it will make more sense shortly when I show you this demo of combining these two things for an advanced sort of initial access technique. There's quite a lot going on in this, so this is why I'm on Zoom. I've got embedded narration, so I'm just going to step back while this plays. Step one of the attack. We've set up a poison tenant in Nuclino, and we're now going to use the built-in email invite functionality to invite our target users. We enter their email address, we click to invite, and then Nuclino will send an email to that user from its own domains, inviting them to our poison tenant. If we then look at our team settings, we'll see that there is a pending invite for that user, waiting for them to respond to the invite they've had. For step 2 of the attack, we're going to look at the target user now who's received the email invite from Nuclino. And we can see that it's from a legitimate Nuclino domain, not from an attacker-controlled domain. So when the target user clicks the button to join, they're then prompted to enter their details in order to create an account as the first step. And once they've done that, so basically a one-step process, they then have an account with Nuclino, and they are then automatically joined to the poison tenant. For the final step of the attack chain, we will look at the SAML jacking portion. Here we are looking at the configuration panel for SSO settings for the poison tenant. We've configured them to point to an ngrok domain that we control for testing purposes. Obviously, an attacker could register a more convincing domain if they so wish. We're now going to click to enforce SSO logins, which will result in Nuclino prompting existing users by email to link their accounts to their SSO identity. Looking at the email the target receives, we can see it's a legitimate email from Nuclino domains with a link that points to a Nuclino domain, so there's no real cause for suspicion. The first path to compromise is if the target responds to this email directly. Clicking the button in the email, we can see we are immediately redirected to our malicious SSO server, and that shows us a fake Google login page in this case. If the user enters their credentials here, then the attack is complete. Alternatively, the target may not see the email or may not immediately respond to it and continue to use their authenticated session with Nuclino. Eventually, this session will expire, which we are going to simulate in this case just by logging out. This will cause existing tabs and links to redirect back to the tenant-specific login page. We can see this now has a large button prompting to log in via SSO. If the user clicks this button to log in now, then they are immediately directed to our malicious SSO page where they can enter their credentials for capture. Okay, you see that's pretty powerful when you connect those together, and actually the first poison tenant doesn't even necessarily need to be anything of interest. It can just be a staging ground. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to persistence, which is another really interesting phase. This is particularly dangerous in this world. I really wouldn't want to be an incident responder anymore. I've done a bit in the past, but in this world, it's a nightmare to deal with. Traditionally, I would have thought of this as endpoint persistence. Run keys, scheduled tasks, services, all those kind of things. Now, obviously, this is where it gets difficult. From an IR's perspective, if you catch a compromise that's an endpoint compromise early, with a low privileged user on a laptop where they haven't spread all over the network and completely compromised your AD or whatever, you can contain it fairly easily. You take it off the network, you do forensics, you disable accounts, you investigate and so forth. The difficulty in this space is that there's so much that a standard user can do to gain persistence on lots of different systems, even for a low-level compromise. So we'll look at this. But ultimately, we're looking at SaaS-based persistence, like persisting your access to the different apps that they have access to or to the cloud identities that they use to gain access to those. We're going to look a little bit at OAuth access again, where we looked at it from a consent phishing perspective, but it can also be used for persistence. Most people talk about it for consent phishing, but persistence is really interesting too. And we're going to look at some really basic techniques like the use of API keys, link sharing, and something called ghost logins. Simple but powerful. Link sharing is what you expect it. You've obviously no doubt seen it in Google Drive and OneDrive, and it exists in many other platforms. It's an easy way of sharing things with other organizations. It's also a super easy way to maintain access to data you want by decoupling that data from the account. You don't need to maintain access to someone's password or MFA or account once you've done this. You just pick the data you want, you share it, and you've got a link that you can come back to permanently. At least with things like OneDrive and Google Drive, you can kind of see when something's shared. Not that many people tend to be looking at this in particular detail because it's so common for things to be shared. But there are lots of other apps out there that don't even show it. Like I've got Nuclino as an example down the right there. That you really have to go into the settings to see that option I've just shown you. You could just go and share access to the whole wiki for the organization and probably no one would ever notice unless they started going to look for it. It's super simple, but really powerful and hard to deal with when someone does it to 20 different applications you've got from one single account compromise. API keys are another one. They aren't just for admins. A lot of SaaS apps support APIs at the user level. This is Shortcut. It's a ticket management system. We use it in Push. It's a bit like Jira or other things. You can go and create a backdoor API through that as any user. Then you can access any functionality you want with that API key, and you've decoupled it from the account. It's another simple persistence mechanism that IR's got to find. Again, that's on another system, makes it tricky. And something called ghost logins is just different ways of authenticating to the same app. You might have an SSO login, but it still enables you to set a local password. It might be that you can link other social accounts. It might be that you can add like a secondary email address for login. So I think I've got Shortcut, if this then that, and Expensify as examples there. But even if someone's using SSO for everything, if you gain access temporarily, you can use these to just create backdoor accounts effectively. I call them ghost logins. This happened with Snowflake as well. Effectively, you had people, the massive Snowflake breach you had recently, you had these single-factor accounts that were left on the internet. Some of them had just been left that way, but others, I think people had migrated or thought they'd migrated to SSO after initially setting it up, and they didn't realize they hadn't deleted the original local passwords, and the same account was still accessible using that method. So that means they also apply an initial access perspective as well, but they're really powerful for persistence. On a slightly more technical example, OAuth integrations are a lot more flexible when you come to persistence instead of consent phishing. So you can do it similarly to you would do with consent phishing, where you make a custom app and then instead of tricking a user to accept the permissions, you just do it yourself. But if someone's really looking for that, they might see a new weird OAuth app appear in their environment they've not seen before, for example. But you've got more options with persistence. Instead, you can impersonate legitimate apps. So let's say instead of using my own custom OAuth app, I go and sign up for my own Canva tenant maybe, and I connect it to the user's OneDrive. They see Canva as an app in their environment. Maybe that's normal. Maybe they already use it. But now I've got the ability to browse OneDrive via Canva. And it's like, this is like the sort of, it's a bit like PowerShell, and it's like, is it good, is it bad? It's like you're making, offensive use of a legitimate SaaS app there. So you can use that as another sneakier option to sort of hide in plain sight. Well, the third one is you can impersonate client-side apps as well. So like a lot of client-side apps use OAuth, and they can't protect their own secrets. So I'm used Thunderbird as an example here. It's a mail client. I can kind of get the best of both worlds here because I can request whatever permissions I like. I can directly access the API and do whatever I like. Whereas in the Canva example, you're limited by whatever the UI for that particular example gives you. Here I can do whatever I like. And I just look like I'm Thunderbird. And if someone else is already using Thunderbird, it kind of looks fairly legit. So you've got some different options with OAuth. It's pretty bad from a persistence perspective. Okay, onto execution. I said this was different before. Traditionally, we looked at native code, memory resident implants, offensive PowerShell, that sort of thing. In a SaaS-native world, we're not looking at real code execution, but the closest thing I would say is automation workflows, no-code and low-code platforms. They can do incredibly powerful things to connect SaaS apps together, so you can sort of almost build your own custom offensive tool sets using those things. So something I like to call shadow workflows, tools like this. There's many out there. Most of them are based on triggers and events. I think it's the most code execution-like technique in this space. I think it's basically the offensive PowerShell of the SaaS world. And then you decide, okay, rather than use this for a legitimate automation purpose, I use it for something bad, like every time a user receives a new email, I automatically upload it to my own Google Drive or something as a backdoor. So I'm going to see an example of this shortly. But before I do that, again, I want to combine it with another technique. So I'm going to go into the defense evasion phase and look at something I call evil twin integrations. I've kind of alluded to this with what I said about OAuth before, but going one step further, OAuth apps, if you have multiple tenants for this, like multiple Canva tenants or multiple Zapier tenants, for example, they don't use separate OAuth apps. There's one app. So if someone has already consented to an application and you reconsent to it to do something else, you don't get new logs normally. So this is something I call an evil twin integration attack. If you find that someone's already using some sort of OAuth integration that you'd like to use too for an account you've compromised, you can basically reuse that in a custom way without it really generating the sort of new OAuth app or new permission grant functionality. And that's really stealthy. So I'm going to now show you combining shadow workflows and evil twin integrations for like a really stealthy, customizable persistence technique.
To demonstrate our shadow workflow and evil twin integration attack, we begin the journey by being logged in as our compromised Azure account. We don't want to lose access to this account, so we are seeking to backdoor the account to maintain persistent access beyond password changes, MFA resets, or similar response activities. The first step is to enumerate existing OAuth integrations to identify potential targets for an evil twin integration. In this example, we will use the simple GUI option of browsing the apps list in the Microsoft My Apps dashboard. Here we can see there are multiple different Zapier integrations. Zapier is a powerful SaaS automation app and a great potential target. We'll look at what permissions have been granted. Looking at the Zapier To-Do app, we can see it's been granted permissions for file access, which is very useful to us. If we switch to the Zapier Outlook integration, we can see this has been granted access to email as well, another really useful capability. Okay, so it looks like the compromised user was making use of Zapier. Before we jump to creating our own shadow workflows, let's see if we can scope out their account to understand it better. If they've been following good security practices, they probably log in via SSO or social login, so we may just be able to log in directly with their Azure account. Let's give that a try. Okay, so it worked, and we are now in their Zapier account. Let's check out their automation workflows, known as Zaps in Zapier, to see what they were doing. It looks like they have one set up for forwarding expenses that connects their Outlook to their OneDrive. That explains the file and email permissions we saw earlier. Let's double check the integrations to check they look good. Okay, we can see active OneDrive and Outlook connections, and they're for the correct user account. All looks good. At this point, we could backdoor the existing expenses workflow, or we could create a new one and possibly hide it in a different folder. However, there is always the chance that the user may discover this later, and we may get locked out of the Zapier account too. Instead, we are going to create an evil twin integration using a separate Zapier account that only we control. To do that, we'll first sign up for a new Zapier account using our own Google account. Now that we have a new Zapier account, we'll create a new Zap to automatically forward new files in their OneDrive to our own Google Drive account. To do that, we'll create a OneDrive trigger on a new file and connect it to their Azure account. We won't need to consent to any Azure permissions as they have already been granted access by the user previously. Then for the action, we'll select Google Drive and set it to upload a file and connect it to our own Google account and consent for Zapier to access it. The end result will be that Zapier monitors the compromised user's OneDrive in the background and then copies any new files and uploads them to our own Google Drive. Let's publish that and then see it in action. We'll head back to OneDrive and create a new confidential file as a test. Now that's created, we'll head over to our own Google Drive and wait. And there we go, the file has appeared. Our shadow workflow is doing its job. And because we made it an evil twin integration, there will be no logs showing a new application consent or any new permission grants either. Even when the user changes their password, we can go back to our Zapier account and create new shadow workflows using the existing integrations to perform new tasks as well. All things considered, this is a very powerful attack chain.
Okay, hopefully that makes it clear that persistence is pretty powerful in this world too, and you can do it in pretty stealthy ways as well. So now I'm going to look at lateral movement very briefly, and then we'll wrap things up with sort of chained attack demo. This used to be very much infrastructure orientated, endpoint to endpoint, endpoint to server, that sort of thing, and we'd have credential dumping and remote service creation and software deployment tools to sort of move your Cobalt Strike beacons around or whatever you're using. In the SaaS world, we're talking more about moving from one SaaS app to another, or from like one cloud identity to a different cloud identity. There are some really simple techniques for this that we're going to look at, just like basic link backdooring, account recovery mechanisms, and abusing existing OAuth integrations that we find. You can also use SAML jacking that we saw earlier from an initial access perspective. You can use that as a lateral movement technique too. I'll show that in the demo later. This is really basic, but obviously people are expecting phishing links in emails and other things, but once you get onto trusted platforms, people aren't really expected to be phished. A lot of them have basic link hiding techniques you wouldn't find in other external vectors too. So this is just like from Niclino, the wiki, as an example. These sort of things are often not permitted in emails, just like hiding malicious links, or even, that's even if you bother to hover over, or they might sort of just truncate things, and you can use that to exploit subdomains to make things look legitimate. A lot of these things have been considered in vectors where you expect malicious links to come in, but on trusted systems, they obviously don't have the same sort of things. You can then sort of shotgun backdoor lots of links across an entire wiki or other systems once you gain access, and start turning those into other types of phishing techniques that we're going to see later. This is just something, it's a very basic thing, but it's just applicable on so many different applications, and there's just not really much visibility there. You could also do a more targeted version, like say you wanted access to an AWS environment, you go and find a bit on the wiki for new AWS joiners, and you put something subtle in just in the instructions about how they set up their new AWS environment, and you wait until the next new hire joins. There's lots of options. It's pretty basic, but it's one method of starting to extend access once you gain access to other systems. You get access to email. Most of these applications will have account recovery mechanisms that are often email-based. They may have one-time passwords delivered via email or other reset techniques. Again, really basic stuff, but it's often a way of sort of hub and spoke model, moving from like one compromised core cloud identity out to lots of other apps. Or you can sort of abuse existing OAuth integration. So we saw OAuth from a consent phishing perspective. We saw it from a persistence perspective, but also think about some of the apps we looked at earlier. If you just gain access to an account somewhere and then you see it's already connected to somewhere else, like you gain access to someone's Canva account that they signed up for as a trial once with a bad password, didn't like it and forgot about it, but they connected it to their OneDrive, then you find, oh, actually from there I can browse their OneDrive contents. There's basic things like that. So this is kind of how it works in the lateral movement space. So you're talking about finding those flows between systems rather than moving from in endpoint to server or whatever the case is, as it was before. Okay, so I've gone over a lot of content there. I've gone through things pretty quickly and delved into a whole bunch of new things too. It's quite a lot to take in. I want to try and chain it together now and look at what a sort of more connected identity attack look like. So we're going to look at sort of initial access, where we're going to do an attacker in the middle phishing attack, targeting sort of Okta. We're going to use a form of that called browser in the middle, which is a sub-technique I'll show you. And then we'll see how you can use that for then post-exploitation to sort of steal credentials, move to other systems, persist, and set up some lateral movement. And hopefully that gives you an idea of what a more connected attack looks like. So I'll narrate these ones live. I'm using a tool called Evil No VNC. So there are multiple attacker in the middle ones. Most of them, like Evil Jinx and stuff, use web proxy techniques. This is using a VNC technique instead. So what I've got the victim on the left, and we're assuming they've already clicked this malicious link to definitely-not-phishing.com. I've got the attacker on the right running Evil No VNC. It works by basically using VNC to control a browser remotely. So the victim on the left doesn't know, they're not looking at their Okta tenant there. They're looking at a rendering of the attacker's browser that's connected to their Okta tenant. So if I switch on the right, I'll show you the attacker's actual browser. And because of that, because it's VNC, everything is mirrored. So if I'm the victim on the left and I start entering my credentials, the attacker can literally, this is like the hacking in the movies actually, because the attacker can literally watch it keystroke by keystroke as it's happening. So I enter my credentials, then I get prompted for my MFA. I'm using Okta Verify, so I use a one-time password. I get that from my cell phone, and I enter the one-time password, and then I log in. Now, if as a user I wasn't suspicious before, I'm going to be less suspicious at this point because I'm legitimately logged into my Okta tenant at that point. I see the apps I expect to see in the order I expect to see them. Everything looks legit. But I just don't realize I'm actually controlling the attacker's browser instead. It's almost like the virtual equivalent of if I was in a coffee shop and they come over with their laptop and go, oh, do you mind quickly logging into your Okta for me, please? And then taking it back. But it's happened virtually. Now, as an attacker at this point, I could try and be clever. I'm not going to be clever right now. I'm just going to say, I'll cut them off. Thanks. You gave me what I needed. I've now got your Okta session. So this is the initial access bit. Then, if they're using Okta SWA, I might be able to go and directly reveal creds for other systems. Or I can just start establishing sessions to downstream applications to move further for the sort of form of lateral movement. And then if I'd like to, if I'm happy, I can tear that connection down and see what else I've got. So you'll find that, I've also been keylogging, so I've got the password there. Now, obviously, it's only partly useful in this case because of the MFA, but as we saw with cred stuffing before, where else is that password useful? I can then maybe try that against 100 or 1,000 other SaaS apps and see if there's any single factor accounts that pop out. But most importantly for this type of attack is I've got the cookies. This is how I hijack the session. This is how other forms of attacker in the middle techniques work. So that's the initial access point. But the important point after that is what do you do with post-exploitation? So let's say I'm just reloaded this session now as the attacker and I'm thinking, okay, maybe IR are onto me. Maybe the user got suspicious or something else got flagged. I've only got so much time. I want to persist and I want to move. So the first thing is literally just moving to other systems via that cloud identity. This is an SSO account, so it's particularly powerful. I can just click and log into things. And from an IR perspective, okay, I've just done an SWA login to shortcut there. That's already one step that's annoying, because even if someone goes and disables the Okta account now, I've got separate sessions established on all the other applications I've just clicked on. It's quite difficult to actually go and kill sessions on other applications. Most of them don't provide that feature very easily. So that's already one step that is hard to contain. But we're looking for persistence. So I'm going to go, okay, I've logged into shortcut. What can I do here? It's going to be what we saw before. Oh, great. I can create an API key. So now I can come back to shortcut that way, even if they get to that next step further and kick me out of shortcut as well. All right, let's move to a different platform. Okay, I'm connected to their Google Drive. I've compromised a finance user in this example, probably got interesting financial data. Let's share their financial folder, make it a link-based method so I can come back decoupled from the account in future. Great, I've got a backdoor to that too. Okay, let's go to Expensify. Okay, they're a finance user. It makes sense that maybe they were using this. What backdoor options do I have here? Okay, I can create a ghost login because this supports secondary logins. Let me go and add my own Gmail account. And then I can log into this app with a different account simultaneously as the user is using their Okta SSO. Fantastic. So now I've spiraled out to a whole bunch of other systems and I've made custom simple backdoors on every one in different ways. I've used 3 examples here, but I could do it with 20 or 30 or whatever. You see how, from an incident responder's perspective, how difficult this space is. Okay, so on to the slightly more technical example. If I wanted to then move on to lateral movement, I showed you SAML jacking before, and we used it as an initial access technique by combining it with poison tenants. Here, I'm going to say, all right, I've compromised a finance user. So they're not an Okta admin, they're not an Active Directory admin, Entra admin, anything like that. But maybe they're an application owner for Expensify. it's quite common to find non-technical users be admins on certain platforms that they're responsible for. So maybe IT have configured this for SSO at some point, but maybe this user still has admin context just within Expensify. And I've got access to the SAML settings. So rather than setting up a malicious poison tenant, in this case, I can actually change the existing SAML configuration for a legitimate application already in use. So, okay, this is connected up to Okta right now. It's connected to a BugCrowd Okta instance of mine I use for testing. But I can go and change that to my Evil No VNC phishing server instead. So if I go and change this, this turns this then into a watering hole technique. Anyone else in the organization that uses Expensify from then on is going to get hit by this attack. So even if you go back to Okta and just click it or go to Expensify directly, first of all, it takes you to Expensify legitimately, asks you for your domain email again, then it redirects. So like even the most security conscious users are probably going to fall for that. You're just not expecting to be phished at that point when you verified everything that came before, and it's during the authentication mechanism. It's quite hard to spot. So then, you do the cycle again. You compromise more users, then you spread to those applications, persist those, and you do the same kind of cyclical technique you would do in the endpoint space, but you just apply it in this space. So that's what a connected identity attack looks like when you put a bunch of these techniques together. So I've been over a lot in this presentation, and this is the result of research I've been doing over a year now. I did release the SaaS attacks matrix on GitHub. This was inspired by MITRE, but the thing is there's so many new techniques here, I was just like, I just need to make a whole new matrix that's just focused on this problem, not trying to adapt something else. So that's available. I've had quite a lot of interest in it. It's got over 1,000 stars now, so people seem to be taking this seriously now. Some of the things you've seen, you'll probably notice in the drop-downs that you've seen today, but there's lots more if you're interested in this space. So do please go and check that out if it's of interest. So what are the key takeaways? Well, the world is already hybrid SaaS, and it's increasingly SaaS-native, and the startups of today are basically SaaS-native, and they're going to be the behemoths of tomorrow as well. There are many SaaS-orientated attack techniques that do not require endpoint compromises, as we've seen today. So many of those things we looked at got nothing to do with the endpoint, so then your EDR is not going to see anything. It's like so outside of most traditional security controls. Even if you're focused primarily on sort of traditional endpoint compromises, the persistence world in the SaaS space is so interconnected and so powerful that I would strongly recommend becoming a bit more familiar with some of those. They're very simple techniques. It doesn't take that long to learn about them. The problem is the scale of how many things they apply to, but it's well worth considering that, even if you're sort of endpoint focused. And then just generally, if you're a red or blue teamer, the SaaS attacks matrix can help you, so do check that out. So that's of interest. And also, I mean, we're probably going to be expanding our research team at some point in the US. So if you're really interested, then speak to me as well. Because there's a lot more research for the whole industry to do in this world. And that pretty much wraps it up. So yeah, thank you for having me, and any questions? Sure, yeah, let's bring the mic over.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. My question is, do you see any appetite among developers, startups, and whatnot to standardize certain security functions across different SaaS tools so that they're more manageable?
So I haven't, but I've not been surveying them, so it's just that I haven't seen it. But it's a great question because, I mean, we've been down this road with other things in the past, even with like common event log formats and that kind of stuff, and we spent all this time centralizing everything for security purposes being one of those things, and then suddenly we've just decentralized everything again, and everyone's doing everything. Well, so it's a great question, and I feel like something along those lines will need to happen. But so far, really, even things like SAML for SSO are not ubiquitous. Like from what we see, like everyone wants everything to be behind SSO, and that's like what they try to do. But realistically, if you want to use lots of apps, there's only a certain percentage of them that support it. It's a massive percentage that don't support it, and even those that do, some of them are like, oh yeah, you can do that if you pay us 10 times the amount for our enterprise tier. So unfortunately, we're only really at that level on the SSO. So I think if you're talking about monitoring persistence mechanisms and common login formats and all that, I think it needs to happen, but we're going to be waiting a long time.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, so what would you say is the solution? I mean, I see that some of these attacks, I mean, all these attacks are very, very evasive, and it's more than just, oh, looking at the email header, does it look legit? Hover over the link, like some of those are, those are old countermeasures now. So what would you say is the solution for all the problems you just listed?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate. I started this from the offensive side of it, of like new problem space. Let's look at it. So I have slightly opened a can of worms, but I mean, I think it's where do we get started? The first point is a lot of people I speak to aren't really testing these techniques from a red teaming's perspective in their organization. So like I always think, I mean, I'm biased by my own background being a red teamer originally, but I always say like the first thing is to do is to get your red teamers moving to this space and testing out these techniques too, and testing your resilience and like updating your IR playbooks to factor in trying to contain this. I don't want to be pitching push, but obviously we've moved into the browser for like what we do with our product because we're in this space, because it's the one common touch point we generally see with identity attacks. Either they're talking directly to SaaS apps, or they're touching the user's browser but not the endpoint as a whole. And then the browser has visibility of the user's active sessions for other things too. I think in general, for many reasons, that included, we're going to see a lot more people moving into like browser extensions for security purposes. I actually did a different talk on threat hunting in the browser recently, like elsewhere, looking into that problem. But I think ultimately, I don't have any easy answers for you in this. I opened that first can of worms, and now I think the whole industry, we're at the beginning of this, where the attacks have shifted to like the very beginning of the endpoint attack era, when the term EDR didn't even exist yet. There weren't many of them. That's where we are now. It's like, and I think the whole industry is going to have to move a lot in the next 5 to 10 years to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think it also kind of addresses a concern from a talk earlier about how we're protecting mobile devices. I believe it was a second talk that talked about like how a lot of his business is on the phone. Well,
yeah,
doing these kind of SSO mitigations would help that, since there's no EDR typically on end devices. So thank you.
So I'm hearing a lot about these things called enterprise browsers. Do they help deal with these problems in any way?
So yeah, there's enterprise browsers, another place where people are going for more management options within browsers. I mean, I think they tend. I'm not an expert on enterprise browsers myself, but it tends to be looking at a lot of things like DLP and other traditional security controls, but managing them via the browser. I think in general, what I was saying before, is the browser is a new place. What happens to be enterprise browsers and what happens to be browser extensions that companies release, I think is a question that's going to be played out over the next few years. But I think it's all about visibility. If you can get visibility of these things from here, then great. If not, then you need to work out how you get visibility of these things.
Yeah, because I'm actually friends with the security team at Retool. Some folks there. Like,
okay,
what would you tell them to do? And what should they just? Okay, they may have like API logs they send over to us. Like, what should these people build to make your life and our lives easier?
Okay, so yeah, I use Retool briefly myself, but I'm not an expert on it specifically. But if you're talking about generally, like how would application developers, SaaS apps, help with this problem, I think at a basic level, making sure things like SSO are like free and easily supported is one good thing. But to go on to that, it's like making it easy for admins to enumerate and kill active sessions is another common bit that's even at that early point, but is really not common. Like you'll see it on things like some big app. Go on GitHub and you should be able to see exactly where your active sessions are and terminate them from a console. But that's not common functionality. Once someone's got an active session, it's hard to kick them out. From then, I think you need to like look at what are the different methods of enabling other authentication options. So I was looking at all those ghost login methods. That's come from product-led growth. It's come from the fact that they want to make it as easy as possible to authenticate in as many different ways as possible to get new users. But then when people sign up, You don't want there to be a million different ways that your users can get access to the same account. You want to lock it down to the ways that you've defined are good. So enabling control of that to administrators of the tenants is useful too. And I think beyond that, then you're starting to look at how you make security critical logs available, how you sort of make that access easy. So there's a lot of things for them to do, like sort of referring back to another question from before. Ideally, as an industry, we'll have people do it in a standardized way, and I don't think there is a standardized example right now, but those are the kind of things I'd like to see.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Luke.
Thank you very much.